either want to leave the WHO, or they're just objecting to what's going on. So, how do you see the sand shifting here? Is this what is happening?
The sand is exactly shifting, and it's also Mexico, it's Philippines, it's now recently South Africa. I've drafted a letter to reject amendments to the IHR and highlighted the new ones coming up. Two of our parliamentarians have taken up the baton and served that on the WHO. But certainly these countries come from a background of understanding that they are very much ignored within the supranationals of the United Nations and the World Health Organization and the International Trade Organization and all of these other hydra tentacles belonging to essentially the World Economic Forum. And they've started to develop more of a voice during the last 3 years of lockdown and misery, both at the WHO and the United Nations. The specific provisions that they are talking about in the amendments currently being negotiated certainly are very dangerous, and they form part of the letter that I had submitted to these parliamentarians to facilitate and include the following. It's going to make recommendations if, of course, they succeed, which they won't. It's going to make recommendations binding. That was one of the proposals that has been put forward by one of the countries engaged in this negotiation process, and there are 94 of them. So recommendations will then become binding. That, of course, violates the WHO's own constitution. It has no authority to make its recommendations binding. It is, in fact, acting ultra vires or outside the scope of authority. Also, in Article 12, the WHO seeks to strike out the provision that would make it necessary for it to consult with a member state about declaring a public health emergency of international concern in that country, for that country to agree. So they're looking at removing that provision in Article 12 and Article 1. They look to remove the specific terms regarding standing recommendation and temporary recommendation by removing the phrase non-binding from each term. And that one was submitted by Bangladesh. The one before this was submitted by the United States. Then we've got Article 3, removing the clause, full respect for dignity, human rights, and fundamental freedoms. That one was put forward by India. Article 2, expanding the scope of the IHR to events with a potential to impact on public health, and also giving them access to all risks. So not just risks related to to health or public health in particular, very dangerous. And finally, some of those that I've specifically highlighted is, of course, that 13 recommendations would be converted into legally binding orders. And this proposed amendment has come through from Malaysia. Article 15 requires nations to allow access to their sovereign territory. Article 17 is censorship. WHO wants to increase funding to tackle false, misleading, misinformation, or disinformation. And Article 19, the last one I'm going to highlight, Eddie, is unspecified and potentially enormous costs. It's going to cost an enormous amount of money to facilitate everything that the WHO is trying to do.
Yeah, what really jumped out at me when I went through it was some of the points that you made really jumped out. I mean, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, you are, and I mean, I could understand it, and it's pretty plain what was going on. But the attack on misinformation or disinformation, I mean, that's, it's misinformation according to the WHO, which have already made a pig's breakfast of the last pandemic in terms of the information provided that the vaccines would stop transmission and that the vaccines were safe, and if you didn't take them, you were somehow a bad citizen. All that kind of stuff was permeating through. I mean, it would be extraordinary to think that the Central Command and Control in Geneva would be dictating terms to countries throughout the world, which would include censorship of their own citizens on matters of science.
Well, that's what the cartel essentially does. It lurches us from crisis to crisis, ever increasing its power and restricting our fundamental human rights, and increasingly more relying on censorship through the media cartel that they've essentially funded, own, and control. Right at the top, BlackRock and Vanguard owns almost all the corporate media out there. And so they're doing this consistently, they're doing it increasingly, and we're going to have to develop alternative ways not only to communicate with each other, but to share information with the public. Of course, the WHO has also been guilty of many other crimes against humanity, including the cover-up of the tobacco funding scandal, the H1N1 pandemic scandal, the cover-up of the extent of nuclear harm. And in Africa in particular, Eddie, facilitating tetanus injections, what they call tetanus injections, on millions of Kenyan girls and women turned out to be
mm,
laced with HCG, rendering
mm,
millions of them infertile. So I was very happy that the African nations, the 47 nation bloc, took a stand at last year's World Health Assembly and objected to amendments that would violate sovereignty and create further death cycles, in other words, death slavery. But since then, WHO has appointed 2 executive board members from Africa, right? So they're using the carrot or the stick. So what we're seeing happening right now with countries taking a stand, not only through parliamentarians, but also asserting their own rights as people of their own countries, is certainly a joy to see. I know the cartels are very nervous, not only because they tried to suppress our right to know, but also because they said so.